Hey folks, Matt Easton here, ScholaGladatoria. That's right, it was me all along underneath this mask. It's not a mask, it's still Jordan. Just in case you were wondering, I like swords. And I have some friends who like swords. Now and again we get together and we talk about those swords and what it's like to fight with swords. Blades for Days is my podcast, it's all about swords. Not all of it. Sometimes I talk about Cobra Kai or The Mandalorian or whatever crap's going on that week. But most of it's about swords.
And other martial arts.
Oh, and other martial arts. This is a clip of one of my most recent episodes with Matt Easton of ScholaGladatoria.
I mean, there's a big topic that is in my back pocket that I've been working on for a while, but which again I don't have conclusive answers on at the moment. They require more time and more information for me to get to a point where I think I'm ready to start putting videos out on the topic, but potentially it could span across several videos. And it's related to armor. And lots of people superficially understand that wearing armor changes how you fight. On a simplistic basis, it means that you've got more weight, you're a bit slower on your feet, your point of balance is slightly different, your vision, your hearing, your stamina, all sorts of stuff like that. Those are the simple things, but there are some really nitty-gritty things that when you start to look at really accurate replicas of certain armors from certain periods, and actually a lot of armor out there isn't accurate. A lot of armor is made how people think it should be made by modern armorers, and there are lots of armorers who are making like an impressionist painting of medieval armor, but they're not making the tiny details correctly. And but in recent years, much like the HEMA movement, there has been a push amongst the armor community to make ever more anally accurate armor reproductions. And they're going back to the source. They're going back to original bits of surviving armor in collections like Cherbourg, and actually going, okay, well, let's just copy that and see how that works. Because, for example, something I got somewhat obsessed with for several months was wrist articulations in gauntlets. Because many moons ago, and so I'm friends with Toby Catwell of the Wallace collection, and every now and again we have a catch-up conversation about something that happens to be obsessing us. We're both quite obsessive people, and I was at the time obsessed. So he, obviously for many years, was obsessed with English armour and championing the fact that there was a distinctive English style of armour, which when I was a teenager, no one conceded. Everyone said, oh, there's Italian armor, there's German armor, and then there's a sort of continental style armor. But no, once you get into about the 1410s, 20s, right up until the end of the 15th century, there is very much a distinctive, characteristic style of English armor, alongside, not to say that all English people wore it, alongside import armors from Italy and elsewhere. And one of the things that I found fascinating looking at this English armour is that it's very conspicuously noticeable on a lot of English armours that the gauntlets are of a different design to those seen on the continent. And one of the things that's really different is they seem to have more articulation lanes in the wrist. And you think, okay, well, why are they so obsessed with articulation lanes in the wrist? And one possible answer is the English were famous for fighting on foot. I mean, obviously they did fight on horseback as well, but they traditionally, certainly against the French, used to dismount to fight. And even in the Wars of the Roses, fighting against each other, they usually kept some cavalry in the wings, but the majority of the force was made of archers. And then the knights or men-at-arms were dismounted with the archers, mostly to protect the archers, I think. So a little bit similar to the pikemen and musketeers relationship in the 17th century. And I thought, well, maybe it's related to fighting on foot. And the jury's still out on that. But the point is that I started looking at actually how these wrist articulations were made, and I started looking at surviving gauntlets. And what became rapidly apparent to me is that HEMA people most HEMA people don't know anything about armor. Even people who are doing longsword, most of them don't actually really know anything about armor. They know what armor looks like, and they know the basic ideas of the fact that, yeah, it adds weight and heat and these kind of things, but it protects you very well. And but they don't know about the nitty-gritty of armour and how the different pieces interact. And what's interesting is I think there's certain things that we take for granted in HEMA which can't work that way in accurate armour of the day. Things to do with how you step, passing footwork, of how your shoulders, how your arms and shoulders can articulate when you're wearing a breastplate and whatever. But coming back to the wrist, particularly how you cut. And something that blew my mind is to find out that a huge proportion of both Italian and German gauntlets for most of the 15th century, you cannot cut with a sword in the way that most of us cut with a sword. So most of us cut by extending out here, trying to get my hand shot, extending out there. You can't make that angle with traditionally accurately made gauntlets. And that's such a simple thing, it just kind of blew my mind. Now, there are some gauntlets you can do that with. So if you go back to the 14th century and you look at hourglass gauntlets with a very flared cuff, no problem. So long as the knuckle plate is angled in relation to the wrist angle and you have a flared cuff, you can pretty much cut in the way you want to be able to cut. So you can cut through water bottles or titanium wraps pretty much normally with hourglass gauntlets on. But if you go a little bit further into the 15th century, when a lot of sources, certainly the German sources, date from, you can't cut like that. But do we actually see them cutting like that in armour? No, they don't really do it. They half sword and they thrust and they cut a bit like the Indians using a tulwar. They cut with a stiff wrist and cutting from the elbow and from the shoulder. So it has a whole knock-on chain of ideas and makes me think, are we actually cutting with the right body mechanics here? Because if you have a gauntlet which restricts your ability to flex your wrist in that direction, incidentally, these gauntlets allow you to flex the wrist in this direction, but not in this direction. So they restrict you in cutting in certain ways, which makes me go all the way back and think, are we actually cutting with medieval swords in the wrong way? And you start looking through medieval art and you start to see there are examples of people extending the blade out like we would see with a saber in later swordsmanship, but there's a huge number of examples of people cutting with what I call a stiff wrist, as we see in Indian martial arts, as we see in certain Filipino martial arts. And so it makes me think, are some of our fundamentals wrong?
If you want to listen to more episodes, you can find us on Spotify. You can find us on Podbean. You can find us on
iTunes.
Huh?
iTunes?
What?
iTunes?
iTunes. Melissa's here too. I'm not going to do that bit. I might do it. I might leave that in. I'll leave it in. You can find us on the website www.academyofsteel.com. Go to blogs, podcasts, it's there, it's easy to find. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe.